I know you. You're that jaywalking punk anarchist.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer.
And Noah Samsen, hello.
And we're taking a look at The Soul of Man Under Socialism by Oscar Wilde, 1891. The key idea of this text is... Noah.
Oh, you wanted me... I thought you were gonna... No, go ahead. That's all you.
Yeah, this thing's kinda all over the place. For a little 20-page book, this thing discusses crime and Christianity, economics and journalism, art criticism. It's a little bit of everything. So, I don't know, I guess let's just dive into it.
Sounds good to me.
Wilde starts by telling us that socialism ensures individual freedom. He states, "The chief advantage that would result from the establishment of socialism is, undoubtedly, the fact that socialism would relieve us from that sordid necessity of living for others, which, in the present condition of things, presses so heartily upon almost everyone." It's funny because we often think, in common parlance in pop philosophy, that socialism is this kind of hyper-selfless, hyper-collectivist life of servitude to the common good, and that the libertarian Ayn Rand style capitalist society is the kind that's all about individualism, liberty, freedom, and not living for others. But as we'll see, this isn't the case. Wilde explains that under our current economic system, capitalism, the majority of us have unhealthy and degrading lives, forced on us, living in hideous poverty and starvation. Now, it's important to remember that Wilde was writing in the Dickensian era of the 1980s. No, not the 1980s, the 1890s. Spot the difference. It's important to remember that Wilde was writing in the Dickensian era of the 1890s.
I was involved in an accident at work. I lost 2 fingers. So I contacted Victorian Claims Direct to see if I can claim some money for my injuries. They said no, and I got no money at all.
That's right. He got 0 compensation.
There's nothing like this in our modern era. In fact, our streets and parks aren't even full of homeless people. Well, not since the most recent police sweeps of the homeless encampments.
There's no plagues going on or anything like that. That's a thing of the past. We're fine. Everything's good.
Yeah, right? Like, nothing like that. Not at all. No, it's totally cool. So under capitalism, we live degrading, unhealthy lives. Whether it's the child labor in factories and slums of the Dickensian era, or the service industry, wage slavery, rampant homelessness, and sweatshops and rare earth mining and stuff like that of our own era. So how do we solve this problem? Well, Wilde says something I find very interesting. He states, they try to solve the problem of poverty, for instance, by keeping the poor alive. Or, in the case of a very advanced school, by amusing the poor. Now, in the world of canine literary analysis, this is what we like to call a biting criticism. We often pat ourselves on the back for our modern amenities and social safety nets, our soup kitchens and homeless shelters and food stamps and school lunches for little children and all the rest. But we aren't really ensuring a society where people thrive, just a society where they probably won't starve to death. Or as Wilde puts it, this is not a solution, it is an aggravation of the difficulty. The proper aim is to try to reconstruct society on such a basis that poverty will be impossible.
Another way that I interpreted this point, specifically the bit about how amusing the poor only aggravates the problem, is how it applies to the ways that we create and consume leftist content online. On the consumption end, viewing and interacting with left content can feel like we are taking a step towards solving the problems being discussed. It can feel like its own form of activism, but it's most often not. And that's okay. Learning is a crucial step in the process, and we need to be entertained to stay sane.
Yeah, great point. It's an interpassivity type problem, something we should keep in mind when the journalism and art critique stuff comes up later in the text. Wilde then takes this poignant criticism and aims it right at the concept of private property. He states, "It is immoral to use private property in order to alleviate the horrible evils that result from the institution of private property. Under socialism, all this will, of course, be altered." As we've seen in the various videos discussing Marxism, capitalists profit from the exploitation and expropriation of the product of their workers. So it's insufficient, in fact insulting, to take some portion of that profit through taxes or private charity or something like that to try and address the poverty that that system of private property creates. Also, and I hate to be like the millionth one to clarify this, but just in case you don't know, this isn't about personal property, it's about private property. Your personal toothbrush or house or cell phone is personal property that you personally use. Private property is property that's owned as capital. This is not about owning a cell phone, it's about owning a factory that makes cell phones that you will never use but will sell for a profit. It's not about owning a home, it's about owning extra homes that you don't use but instead rent them out for profit. I think, Noah, you're pretty familiar with that one, right?
Yeah, I unfortunately am. I was recently in some YouTube beef with a landlord who makes eviction content on TikTok. I know I'm going to hell for uttering that sentence. Turns out he owns over 100 apartments, pulls in around $100,000 a month from them, all while exploiting the people he's displacing. It's a pretty egregious example of how broken the for-profit private land ownership system is, but it's not unique to him, and so basically Wilde would say, get rid of it.
Yeah. When someone else owns these structures we use to produce the goods of society, that puts us in a position of living our lives for the owner. It is this system of property, this system of living for others, that Wilde wants to do away with. Wilde goes on to argue that a socialist political revolution will, by converting private property into public wealth and substituting cooperation for competition, that this will ensure the well-being of the community. But how is this converting going to take place? There are many ways to convert private property into public wealth. We could have a centralized authoritarian government nationalize it. Or, as Wilde argues, for the full development of life to its highest mode of perfection, what is needed is individualism. So like, an individualistic communism?
That's right, y'all. Bootstraps communism. The most epic crossover since the Fortnite Balenciaga hoodie.
Well, not quite. Or maybe kinda? Like, this doesn't have to be some sort of nationalization, bureaucratic state control by a centralized authority. Instead, you can have what's called for in State and Revolution and ABC of Anarchism, Conquest of Bread, and elsewhere. You have the workplaces taken over by those who work them. Allow for democratic self-management.
I find the way that Wilde writes about how this new socialist world will look to be very moving. Once the reconstruction is complete, the system will, he says, restore society to its proper condition of a thoroughly healthy organism and ensure the material well-being of each member of the community, giving life its proper basis and its proper environment. Need that real bad. Let's get this shit on the trending page and start a change.org position for socialism.
Returning to the subject of our unhealthy and degrading lives, Wilde states, "The best amongst the poor are never grateful. They are ungrateful, discontent, disobedient, and rebellious. To recommend thrift to the poor is both grotesque and insulting. It is like advising a man who is starving to eat less. It is safer to beg than to take, but it is finer to take than to beg." I don't know about your experiences with customer service gigs, but at the thrift store and grocery store jobs I've had, I've heard a lot of folks talk about how shoplifters should just go on welfare and food stamps, how they could understand someone stealing bread or eggs, but shoplifting headphones or a candy bar is unacceptable, or how it's ridiculous that folks on food stamps will then blow their meager paychecks on tattoos or video games. But I've always found such complaints disheartening and frustrating. It's like people think that if you're poor, you're just supposed to spend your days like groveling in shame. Heaven forbid you're poor and want to spend a night drinking with friends. God forbid you're poor and want a smartphone. Shame on you if you're poor and steal a candy bar rather than a loaf of bread. Wilde points to this ridiculous shaming of the poor and calls it exactly what it is: grotesque and insulting, and that it's actually finer to take than to beg.
Also, sadly, for a lot of people, even begging instead of stealing is still worthy of ridicule. Like how some people talk about not wanting to give to the homeless because they'll just spend it on liquor or whatever. Like, have you ever been homeless? I have not, but I can't imagine it's something I'd want to be sober for the whole time. I don't want to be sober right now, and I have a place to live, so.
Oh, for sure. It's like folks want to deny people down on their luck any semblance of the comfort and joy they have no problem enjoying for themselves. When I think about this stuff, I often think about this one time I was at the airport on a 6-hour layover in the middle of the night, trying to sleep on the floor. I didn't have any pillows or blankets, just me and the floor. But I was indoors, it was temperature controlled and all that. But still, I would have killed for some booze or something to help me sleep or be more comfortable on the hard ground. Now imagine you're out there on the street in the noise and the cold, on the concrete under an overpass or on a sidewalk. Why wouldn't you want some booze or oxy or heroin, something to have some semblance of comfort and joy in your life? Returning back to the subject of authoritarian versus libertarian socialism, Wilde argues that no authoritarian socialism will do. Authority and compulsion are out of the question. All associations must be quite voluntary. Anarcho-capitalists and capitalist libertarians and other free market types often consider themselves as having a monopoly on voluntary association, as if hierarchical capitalist institutions aren't actually far more coercive and authoritarian than democratic ones. As we'll see, it is not capitalism that ensures individualism and voluntary associations, but libertarian socialism which does. Wilde states, "The recognition of private property has really harmed individualism and obscured it by confusing a man with what he possesses. Private property has crushed true individualism and set up an individualism that is false." Basically, capitalism might sell us an alienated, atomized individualism, but true individualism is about being an important member of a community, not being a replaceable cog in someone else's machine, but being someone who truly matters as an individual.
Wilde rephrases this once more when he writes, "The true perfection of man lies not in what man has, but in what man is." I think he's emphasizing the importance of actualizing the soul by laying out this negative comparison with material obsession, an obsession that is a product of capitalism and most negatively affects those with no capital. And not to beat a dead horse here, but that is what gets in the way of that sense of true individualism. By the way, why is that a phrase? I feel like beating a dead horse isn't as bad as beating a live horse to death, which is kind of the precursor to finding yourself beating a horse that just so happens to already be dead. Like in the metaphor, that part at the end where the horse is dead and you're beating it is what's too far, but just before it, when you actually kill, just never mind, okay? Can we cut this out, please?
Nope, we're leaving that in.
We'll do it live! Fuck it!
Wilde continues, "With the abolition of private property, then, we shall have true, beautiful, healthy individualism. Nobody will waste his life in accumulating things and these symbols for things. One will live." Basically, if we think back to the phrase, "to reconstruct society on such a basis that poverty will be impossible," this is what Wilde is getting at. He doesn't want us to just be not starving, he wants us to thrive, to live fulfilling lives. This is what the soul stuff in Soul of Man Under Socialism is all about. He states, "In the treasury house of your soul, there are infinitely precious things that may not be taken from you, and so try to shape your life that external things will not harm you, and try also to get rid of personal property." This is about how personal development is better than personal items. Like, what makes you happier in the long run? Buying some nonsense stuff you don't need, or taking some time to read a book or hang out with friends? For example, I like video games. And that's awesome, that's totally okay from time to time. But one time, I broke my leg in a mosh pit and was unable to work for a while, and rather than do cool, self-fulfilling things like read or play music or visit friends, I just spent weeks sitting in front of the TV, drinking beer, and playing video games, and I was totally miserable because of it. Now, all this personal development stuff sounds fine, but then Wilde takes it a bit too far for my tastes. He starts giving me some biblical give up all your earthly possessions, turn the other cheek type vibes that I don't get down with. He states, "If a man takes their cloak, they are to give him their coat, just to show that material things are of no importance. If people abuse them, they are not to answer back. Even if people employ actual violence, they are not to be violent in turn. After all, even in prison, a man can be quite free. His soul can be free." Now wait a minute. Give up your coat, don't answer back? I thought we just established that this isn't a socialism steeped in hyper selfless, collectivist, no personal property type socialism. Like, sure, have control over your internal peace in a sort of Buddhist inner peace sense, but I totally disagree with this sacrificial pacifist mindset. And it's hard to believe that Wilde really believes it either, especially after all that shit he said about stealing stuff just a second ago. Anyways, next Wilde brings us back to the topic of authority, starting with something quite anarchist. He states, individualism, then, is what, through socialism, we are to attain to. As a natural result, the state must give up all idea of government. Now, this could have easily come from Alexander Berkman or Peter Gerdeluce, Emma Goldman, or any number of anarchist authors. But, to be honest, this could have come from Marx himself. For example, do you remember this quote from the Critique of the Gotha Program review? Marx states, as far as the present cooperative societies are concerned, they are of value only insofar as they are the independent creations of the workers, and not protégés either of the government or of the bourgeoisie. Then Wilde drops a banger. He states, authority is quite degrading. It degrades those who exercise it, and degrades those over whom it is exercised. That second part seems obvious, but that first part not so much. How the heck is someone degraded when they exercise authority over others? Well, think about an abusive relationship. Yeah, there are benefits to being abusive. That's why abusers abuse. They bypass having to contribute by using threats and violence, but at the same time, they have degraded themselves. They've robbed themselves of an equitable relationship built on mutual aid. Instead of having a situation where they're working together on a common goal, one party is using their time and energy and effort to force the other party to comply, creating a situation in which the relationship is less valuable than the sum of its parts. Let's make a crude example to explain what I mean here. Let's say a couple is making dinner. The two of them can come together, each contributing an hour of their time and energy to make the meal. Or one could use 30 minutes of their time and energy, not on the meal, but on threatening their victim into spending, let's say, an hour and a half of their time and energy making the meal. Now, I know which dinner I would enjoy more. And this goes for all relationships on which an unjustified hierarchy is established. Between a master and a slave, a lord and a serf, a manager and employee, the authoritarian relationship degrades all the participants and destroys the potential for true mutual aid.
Wilde extends this analogy of the degradation of authority to democracy, writing, high hopes were once formed of democracy, but democracy means simply the bludgeoning of the people by the people for the people. That right there is what we call a bar, folks. Bar! Now, okay, I'm sort of new to this, right? But the way I understand this is when one mass of people is able to make a decision on behalf of another mass of people, that, in a way, is its own form of authority and hierarchy. Donald Trump winning the election was me getting hierarched, getting ratioed by all the people from my high school that I hate and their grandparents. When we compare this to something like localized consensus decision-making, for example, the level of possible coercion and authority is far lower, which I think is what Wilde alludes to here as being ideal.
Next, Wilde talks about crime and punishment. He states, one is absolutely sickened, not by the crimes that the wicked have committed, but by the punishments that the good have inflicted.
Justice served, punished. The satisfaction of justice served is the pleasure we take in inflicting or witnessing the suffering of someone who deserves it.
Yeah, I think most folks on the left understand this, that the purpose of criminal justice should be rehabilitation, not retribution. Then, Wilde makes a pretty standard lefty argument about crime. He states, starvation and not sin is the parent of modern crime. When private property is abolished, there will be no necessity for crime, no demand for it. It will cease to exist. Now that's a little hyperbolic. I don't think crime will ever cease to exist, but I think he's absolutely right in saying that it's not about sin. In fact, I don't think it's really about starvation either. It's about injustice. In areas where starvation is shared, crime is low. Where abundance is shared, crime is low. Crime is highest where there are stark inequalities. Just think about it. If we all lacked shelter, there would be no shelter to steal. And if we all had shelter, there would be no reason to steal shelter. But if shelter is unevenly distributed or accessible, frustrations and jealousy and a sense of injustice leads to crime. For example, I recently had my car broken into and my tent was stolen out of the back. Now you might be thinking, Radical Reviewer, why was your tent in your car? Well, you see, at my previous apartment, I didn't have a lot of extra room for my camping gear, so I left it in the car. And even though I live in a larger apartment now, I still kept my camping gear in the car out of habit, but also because I kind of developed this fantasy in my mind about how having my camping gear in the car would mean that I could go camping at a moment's notice, and this would inspire me to spontaneously camp all the time, and that never actually happened. It's a whole thing. Anyways, I live in a city where homelessness is rampant, and I imagine someone looked in my car and saw some camping gear, and it wasn't essential for my shelter, I wasn't currently using it, and they decided, I'm gonna steal that tent. Now, of course, I rather provide shelter through collective ownership of the means of production, or at the very least through social services paid through my taxes, or hell, even just giving them the $20 tent, rather than having to spend $300 replacing the broken window. But I guess that's what this is all about. Or as Wilde puts it, when each member of the community has sufficient for his wants, and is not interfered with by his neighbor, it will not be an object of any interest to him to interfere with anyone else. And of course, to achieve this, Wilde wants the same worker control of the means of production solution that I do. He states, "The state will be a voluntary association that will organize labor and be the manufacturer and distributor of necessary commodities." Then Wilde gets all Bookchinian on us, talking about automation taking over all the crappy jobs. He says, "Man is made for something better than disturbing dirt. All unintellectual labor, all monotonous, dull labor, all labor that deals with dreadful things and involves unpleasant conditions must be done by machinery." Now, as you might know, Oscar Wilde was an upper-class, nerdy playwright who came from a wealthy family, went to upscale universities, so while I might say that I enjoy being a dishwasher, I get to listen to music and podcasts, it's a solid workout, I don't have to deal with customers or managers in my business, but I think Oscar Wilde might lack the appreciation for my monotonous, dull job. That said, one part of me does want to take the Bookchin approach and say, yeah, I mean, machinery can do the monotonous work. We've talked about this in the review of Post-Scarcity Anarchism, about how robots can do the boring tasks and save all the fun, fulfilling, and artistic work for ourselves. But another part of me wants to go all Michael Albert about this and talk about how we will likely never be done away with monotonous work completely, so instead we should focus on distributing the interesting and empowering work and the monotonous work evenly among the workforce.
After high school, I worked at a corporate pizza chain as a delivery driver. While this was obviously a form of monotonous, alienating work, you pick up the pizzas, you drive them, you drop them off, you repeat. Much like your dishwashing example, over time I was able to maneuver that monotony into the background, making that process tolerable, if not boring. This doesn't mean I loved it. In fact, one of my early motivations for succeeding on YouTube was to make sure that I didn't have to go back to doing that, but I understand why it exists. And as nice as Wilde's declaration of the future end of monotonous work sounds, I'm not sure how confident I'd feel about a self-driving Tesla shooting a pizza onto my porch without hitting someone with the pizza, or on the road with the car.
Look on the bright side. With how often Teslas catch fire, at least the pizzas will probably be warm.
That's a good point.
Anyways, as an artist, as a content creator, I find some of Wilde's art takes very compelling. Others I find pretty wild. He talks about how the public wanting art for consumption is exercising authority over art, and that is bad, that art should never try to be popular, that the public dislike novelty because they are afraid of it. It represents to them a mode of individualism, an assertion on the part of the artist that he selects his own subject and treats it as he chooses. He explains that good art is personal, whereas bad or unhealthy art is old-fashioned and common and whose subject is deliberately chosen. And part of me thinks, yeah, I love rare, unique, strange stuff, but popularity also has its place. Like, I could talk until I'm blue in the face about how some dystopia or Osrotten song is very important and has this important political message. But if the friend I'm talking to can't understand the words and can't stand the sound of the music, it's good that I can recommend something more popular like How the World Works by Bo Burnham instead. Wilde then takes a little detour from the art and talks about violence. He states, "Many of the most important problems of the last few centuries have been solved entirely by means of physical force." I mostly bring this up to say that I agree, and also, doesn't that sound a little contrary to the turn the other cheek, don't be violent stuff from earlier? Anyway, the next topic of discussion is more related to art, at least for us here in this educational information content creator sphere on YouTube. He talks about
the fake media.
You are fake news. Fake, disgusting news.
He states, "In old days, men had the rack. Now they have the press. That is an improvement, certainly, but still very bad and wrong and demoralizing." And this is so true when it comes to bad press like Steven Crowder, Ben Shapiro, OAN, or whatever. But a bad divide has occurred within media skepticism, between correct and good media critique like the new media monopoly, manufacturing consent, and things like that, and bad dumb media critique like Donald Trump, QAnon, distrust the media type stuff. Wilde argues that journalists are more concerned with gossip than real news. I suppose he was probably referring to whatever was the TMZ of his day.
Somebody took a photo of him and Pete Davidson walking on the street, so this is just his way of lashing out. Oscar, please, TMZ news is great, you know it, I know it, everybody knows it, leave him alone.
The next point Wilde makes, I think really applies to us content creators. He states, "There are possibly some journalists who take a real pleasure in publishing horrible things, or who, being poor, look to scandals as forming a sort of permanent basis for an income." And to be honest, perhaps us content creators in the trend-chasing, viral-addicted social media landscape, we're all prey to this now. Do I want to click on this video about a local political issue that's relevant to my personal life? I'm going to put that in my Watch Later playlist. Ooh, dunking on Ben Shapiro video number 487. Click on that, brother. Let's tune in. Woohoo! I mean, I use clickbait thumbnails for my videos, at least for the first few weeks before changing them to my standard style.
If publishing horrible things and scandals to make money is what bad journalism is, then let's be honest, YouTube kind of thrives on bad journalism. Leftist political content is not immune to this phenomenon either. Educational videos about theory or mutual aid will almost always lose out to videos about who said what on which live stream and why they're really stupid because of it. And that's fine if success on the platform is your primary goal, but if you're actually wanting to help others develop an understanding of the world through education and art, the road to growth may be a bit longer for you, but by all means do it. Please, for the love of God, do it. Soon after this, Wilde writes, "But there are journalists, I feel certain, men of education and cultivation, who really dislike publishing these things, who know that it is wrong to do so, and only do it because the unhealthy conditions under which their occupation is carried on oblige them to supply the public with what the public wants, and to compete with other journalists in making that supply as full and satisfying to the gross popular appetite as possible." I think this is also super relevant. To make a living and stay afloat doing what we do, there has to be some sort of acknowledgement to how the system works. We have to do the titles and the thumbnails and cover the trending stuff, but the true artists will continue to shine through all of this by virtue of their ability and willingness to innovate and stay true to themselves and their art. And I think audiences are usually able to pick up on that.
Wilde's solution, on the other paw, is to totally ignore the audience. He states, "A true artist takes no notice whatever of the public." Fat chance of doing that in this algorithm day and age. I think maybe someone could argue that uncompromising art actually can take off in this atmosphere. Look at Salad Fingers, Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared, and other sort of outsider avant-garde cinema. But I don't know. My relationship with the algorithm and appeasing it and things like that is pretty cynical. I guess what I mean to say is, thanks for watching, folks. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the bell icon.
Same here. Please do both of those things to me. I promise it's worth it. I'm not as smart or as well-read or as adorable as my coworker here, but I definitely am some guy on the internet, so there's that for you.
Wilde then explains that we should not be selfish, but probably not in the way you think. He argues that it is selfish to demand others to live and think as we do, and instead we should be selfless and not impose our will on others. Through this selfless individualism, one will realize true sympathy, and not just sympathy with people's pain. That's something Wilde calls tainted with egoism. Instead, he insists that we should sympathize with the entire life, not with life's sores and maladies merely, but with life's joy and beauty and energy and health and freedom. Anybody can sympathize with the suffering of a friend. It requires, in fact, the nature of a true individualist to sympathize with a friend's success. And you know, that's something that I practice every day. I love watching so many wonderful channels blow past me in subscriber numbers. It's great. No, just kidding. I do practice this type of sympathy, at least I think I do. I love watching fellow leftist channels take off. I think that that's awesome. Anyways, coming to the end of the text, Wilde summarizes his ideas thusly. When socialism has solved the problem of poverty, and science solved the problem of disease, the area of the sentimentalists will be lessened, and the sympathy of man will be large, healthy, and spontaneous. Man will have joy in the contemplation of the joyous life of others. And Wilde concludes, pleasure is nature's test, her sign of approval. When man is happy, he is in harmony with himself and his environment. The new individualism, for whose service socialism, whether it wills it or not, is working, will be perfect harmony. It will be complete, and through it each man will attain his perfection. The new individualism is the new Hellenism. Conclusion. So this little book is a breezy 20 pages or a quick hour-and-a-half audiobook, and yet somehow discusses crime and Christianity, economics, journalism, art criticism. It goes all over the place. So obviously the word count to subject ratio is all out of whack, and there's not a lot of deep dives into any of these subjects. But for what it lacks in in-depth explanations, it makes up for in super quotey witticisms.
The proper aim is to reconstruct society on such a basis that poverty will be impossible.
It is immoral to use private property in order to alleviate the horrible evils that result from the institution of private property.
It is safer to beg than to take, but it is finer to take than to beg.
Authority is quite degrading. It degrades those who exercise it and degrades those over whom it is exercised. I will definitely be throwing these quotations around when the opportunity arises. What do you think, Noah?
Yeah, I think that Wilde makes a lot of these points with a certain eloquence that for relative newbies like me is helpful just to hear and get inspired by this better vision of the future without worrying too much about what goes on in the back end. That hopefully comes later, if I keep up with my reading, that is.
If, you said?
When. I'm pretty sure I said when.
No, you definitely said if. Noah, did you use Spark Notes for this collab?
No.
No, you didn't read the book, did you?
I gotta go. You're breaking up. Bad service. No Wi-Fi.
Noah, where are you going? This is a pre-recorded thing. We're both reading this off of a script right now. What are you doing?
Oh, right. Okay. Well, bye everyone. Thanks for watching. And Radical Reviewer, thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you for helping me with this project. And as always, I'd like to thank my wonderful patrons. You're really awesome, and I appreciate you folks a lot. Now, if you saw my last video, you know that I was doing a fan art celebration challenge thing with prizes and whatnot. Well, to all of you who participated and submitted your art in the Discord, the votes were cast, and here are our winners. Woo! Yay! Ah, it's so awesome! Oh, you're a winner! Oh, that's great. Actually, as I'm typing this part in the script, the voting has just started, so I have no idea what's on screen right now, but wow! I mean, all the art looked really awesome when I looked through it, so awesome. Thank you so much to folks who wanted to make art off of the work that I do here. That's crazy to me. That's really cool. Anyways, if you like what I do here and you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/radicalreviewer. And if you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.
Dry our eyes while this racket falls apart. Still we carry a new world in our hearts.
So
So as it turns out, unless you're a young child or a prison inmate, you don't need anyone supervising you. People just come in and do their work on their schedule. Imagine that. People like us allowed to sell paper, unsupervised. And yet, somehow it works.